Okay, we are doing a causes of the Cuban Revolution and the rise of Fidel Castro video here. The objective here is that you'll be able to answer questions looking at the causes, the political, social, and economic causes of the revolution, be able to talk about the use of guerrilla warfare, evaluate the use of guerrilla warfare in the war, and then also be able to talk about the rise of Fidel Castro. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Batista. Batista in the U.S. in 1933, and Batista called for elections. And there he is. Batista basically was a sergeant who was part of the Sergeant Revolt in 1932. Allowed them to take power in 1933, and basically Grau became president. And in that, he started to call for a lot of reforms that so many people in Cuba wanted. And as he pushed for these reforms, what basically happened was that the U.S., under Sumner Welles, negotiated or basically did not recognize the government, forced Batista and his comrades to take over, putting a man in power that Batista then supported, and making deals with the U.S. as far as getting rid of the Platt Amendment, but basically keeping things at the status quo as far as U.S. influence and U.S. business influence over Cuba. Batista calls for elections in 1937, and basically starts moving towards the left. They endorsed mild reform programs with some effort towards land redistribution, openly supported trade unions and the Communist Party. Batista was elected overwhelmingly in 1940. He helped call the 1939 Constituent Assembly for a draft constitution. Grau and other moderates won election, and they produced a document that would protect labor unions, guarantee equal rights to women, limit the right to property, allow for some land redistribution, but basically call for elections. And so Batista then became democratically elected in 1940 because he was popular with most Cubans at this point, because he had gone against the United States. And so therefore, many people felt like Batista was still good for Cuba, and seen him still as a revolutionary rather than a brutal dictator. So he allowed for the Constitution Assembly, and then Grau helped build the Constitution in a way that would help build the future for Cuba. And so what we're going to look at now here is Grau in this picture, and we'll get to him in a minute. Sugar prices and World War II. This allowed really Batista and Grau to remain somewhat in power and remain popular because of the money that poured in during and after the war. The market during the war, sugar prices soared up. And so there were money for social reforms. There was money for some of the things that they wanted to do. However, much of it wound up getting caught in corruption. Although Grau originally was a big-time reformer, became more moderate. And then when he took power, he found it really hard to be able to work for significant change. However, he did work towards organizing unions, which you can see a speech where he's giving it here. Membership in unions rose from 30 to 50%. Workers gained rights to collectively bargain, and the favorable market conditions during the war gave them the conditions to better wages and better working conditions. And so, therefore, under Batista, it seemed like life for Cubans was improving, because Batista was the power behind Grau, but Grau also helped bring about some of these good changes for Cuba. However, in 1952, with tacit U.S. approval, Batista overthrew the Priol government and violently repressed strikes, abolished trade unions, and eliminated restrictions on business freedom. And all of a sudden, the Batista that people had voted in, the Batista that they felt like was going to bring change, became Batista the dictator. And although popular with elites and U.S. business interests, Batista was unpopular with most Cubans. There was no diversification in agriculture. 22 companies held 1/5 of the island's farmland. Much of the land was idle. Sugar kept many unemployed, as most of the workers were only needed during the harvest. There was major corruption during Batista's government. 22 people that were high up in Batista's government had 1 million, equivalent of $1 million US in Swiss bank accounts. These inequities were the foundation of the revolution. And you can really see that. And this is Eddie Chibas, who basically was trying to reform, wanted to take over and become president, and he was elected president, but he was afraid of a military coup. And instead of fighting against that, he basically shot himself during a live radio broadcast to make it clear of his, because he knew that the chances of him dying in a military coup was very likely, and so he wanted to just make a statement to the world about all the corruption and problems that there was in Cuba. And so that's basically Batista, the corruption and taking over, which really caused a lot of the issues that led to the movement. Now, what we have here is Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was a son of sugar farmers. He became a lawyer, but was really part, and in his education, in his college education, he became part of this. In colleges, many of the protests, many of the radical thoughts, many of the reformers were located in the university, and Fidel was influenced by this. And although he was from the middle to upper middle class, he really was wanting to bring about revolution. He became a lawyer, didn't really like wanting to be a lawyer, found himself involved in politics, and that's really kind of where he wanted to head with his career. And in part of that, then he kind of fell into that tradition of violent revolts within the Cuban history. And so he starts the 26th of July movement with the attacking of the Moncada Army barracks. He led 150 non-communist, mostly middle-class Cubans, many young, just out of college or in college. They tried to attack and defeat the army with the idea that that would lead to a rise in popular revolts around Cuba. Instead, they were outnumbered 10-1 and were decimated. So 80 were captured and tortured. Castro and his brother were later captured, and Castro is here standing trial. Castro's trial became more of a place where he laid out his movement. He called it, basically his speech ends with "History will absolve me," and that becomes the title of it. And by 1955, this speech was published and distributed throughout Cuba. Over 10,000 copies of this was circulated throughout Cuba. So, remarkably, because of Castro's "History will absolve me," I want to tell you a few things. So he spoke about the return to power to the people. He spoke about redistributing land, introducing worker profit and sharing in pensions, attack corruption, improve education, nationalize public utilities, introduce rent controls, show solidarity with the democratic people of Latin America, and diversify the economy. Right there you can see many of the reasons for why Castro is revolting at this point. Many of the things that you see here show that he is moving forward, really wanting to, or he is really pointing out that the land is a major issue in Cuba, that the corruption of the government, that workers aren't able to make enough and don't have pensions, and that the rents are too high, and that the education is low within Cuba, and having all the public utilities owned by foreign companies and foreign countries puts Cuba at risk. So, because of his family connections and Batista's overconfidence, he basically pardons Castro and his brother and a few others, and they leave and go to Mexico, who is still proud of their own revolution, and therefore has welcomed a lot of the people throughout Latin America that are revolting against these dictators that had taken control. In 1956, Castro and his failed invasion a second time. So, now while he was in Mexico, he watched the CIA overthrow a democratically elected government in Guatemala because they said they were communists. He watched the U.S. Continue to influence Latin America, and that really shaped the way he wanted to go about this. While he was gone in Mexico, there were protests and strikes, which Batista used his special police to use torture and violence to put it down. And really, a guerrilla campaign begins against Batista in 1954 with women and others. They worked for the revolution, for the July movement, but also other people and other revolutionaries that were part of the opposition political parties began to revolt. You see bombs and strikes and large protests, work stoppages, all in a way to try and revolt and cause problems for Batista. Here you see Castro. So what happens is Castro comes back in 1956 on an old boat called the Granma. Now, he wanted to land right where Martí had landed 60 years earlier. And coming with him is Che Guevara and his brother, who both become kind of assistant leaders or second in commands to Castro. Raúl Castro is one of the leaders, and then this guy by the name of Che Guevara, who is a Argentine national, who then meets him in Mexico, is invited by Castro to come and be a part of the Cuban Revolution. So Castro was going to land with 82 guerrillas in the same place Martí did, but however, a storm, and then Batista knew about the landing, and so they made about 90-mile journey to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, the whole time being basically chased and harassed by Batista and his army, and only about 21 guerrillas make it to the mountains. And then they made 90-mile journey to Sierra Maestra Mountains. Around 21 guerrillas made others either killed or captured by Batista. The whole time, Batista is telling the world that Castro is dead, that Castro died during the revolution. Now, Castro, being the heady person he knows that propaganda is just as important as the actual acts of guerrilla warfare. So when you're looking at guerrilla warfare, winning the propaganda battle is huge. And he knew he needed to erode Batista's power in several different places. One, foreign support. Two, with the people of Cuba. And so Castro held an interview with a famous New York Times reporter. This enhanced Castro's credibility in the U.S. and among Cuban people, and also the Cuban exiles, or Cuban people that were in the United States. The article overstated the breadth of the revolution. Basically, Castro had talked about how the revolution was much larger than it actually was. There were only 21 or so guerrillas. They continued raids on government forces, and as they continued to work against the government forces, the recruits, more importantly, they were gaining support throughout the Cuban people. And a lot of what happens over the next couple of years is that because he brings the revolution and himself to the international scene, many people in the U.S. stopped supporting Batista over the next couple of years. And so this article and the use of propaganda was one of the effective parts of his guerrilla campaign. Mid-1957, there was just general violence become endemic all throughout Cuba. There were other revolutionary groups, urban revolutionaries, independent of Castro, who used terrorism, general strikes, and other techniques to destabilize Batista's control over the economy and in the cities. In 1957, there was a huge bomb that terrorized Havana, actually sent out all the electricity throughout the Guantanamo Bay, Cuba base, and basically those bombs just showed the kind of breadth of the guerrilla warfare that was being used in the cities. And some of these people were loosely affiliated with the July 26 movement, but for the most part, they were not. But Castro also used guerrilla warfare in the mountains and supported what was going on in the cities to win. Castro attacked sugar fields, starting with his own families first, which obviously gives him a place to talk, a place to be able to talk from. They sent flyers to sugar workers instructing them to tie gasoline-soaked rags to rats, light it on fire, and in order to run away from where they feel the fire is behind them, they'll run through the sugar fields and burn them up. There was from 1953 to 1959, there was an estimated 30,000 acts of sabotage against sugar processing plants, large estates, banks, company headquarters, and other government places in the city. The Cuban economy suffered, with unemployment going from 8.9 to 18%. Castro, by going after and using guerrilla warfare, not just against Batista's army with ambushes and bombings and those types of things, but by going after the economic support of by the economy of Cuba, he knew that would lead to a eroding of support of Batista. Che Guevara and his 300-plus guerrillas operated in central Cuba, taking the city of Santa Clara and capturing a strong government hold of 2,500 soldiers. Basically, they were demoralized because of trying to fight against the guerrillas. You also see Raul fight on the other side of Cuba and begin to take Santiago and other places. But Batista continued to use repressive techniques. So basically, Castro knew by using guerrilla warfare, it would force Batista to continue to use his repressive techniques, which would drive even more and more Cubans to Castro's side. You can even see that Batista starts using violence and torture against women, which continues to erode his support. And at the same time, when Castro is confiscating livestock from the rich and other food, but when he comes in contact with the poor, the people of the mountains, Sierra Mountains and others, they buy the food. They take care of the poor. And so the poor begin to not work with Batista and give him intelligence on Castro, but to support Castro because they see that he understands what they want and need. In 1958, junior naval officers had an aborted revolt. Batista used bombers to quell it. His use of brutal tactics just basically alienated some of his support from the United States. His arms agreement with the U.S. was basically stopped or forbade the use of it domestically, and then basically an arms embargo is put on Batista. This is another picture of Castro's guerrilla war. He used techniques against Batista's poorly trained army. Many of them were fresh recruits. So his 320 men were able to launch constant ambushes, attacking supply lines, leaving bombs against some of Batista's different military headquarters and things like that, so that Castro's guerrillas convinced Batista's soldiers that they were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They were frustrated that they couldn't find Castro and attack him, and Batista dropped napalm on his own men. This should seem familiar since we're talking about the Vietnam War and some of the things, some of the problems that the U.S. had there as well. Basically, Castro became the complete antithesis of Batista, and this leads to him being able to take control. And then by December 1958, the war is basically Batista is his power is crumbling. Actually, this is Batista's army going into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, ready to board and go after Castro. Many of these men deserted because of the techniques that were used against them, because napalm was dropped on them, and they didn't want to fight for Batista anymore. And so they deserted in droves. Over 20% of the army deserted during this campaign. And basically what happens is Castro, Raul, and Che Guevara all have bands of several thousand, and they're able to march on Havana in January 1959. As Batista's power crumbles, Castro begins what he would call his revolution, the M26-7, where they were going to emphasize Cuban nationalism, unite Cubans around a story of rising out of oppression, and address the inequities of Cuban society. They started right away with an Agrarian Reform Act, and then continue to use different policies and things to push the Cuban Revolution forward. Thanks for listening to this video, and I hope it was helpful, and we will talk about it tomorrow.